In these days before Christmas, I was asked to reflect on the first verses of Matthew chapter 2. Now, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he that is born king of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east, and are come to worship him. In my short presentation, I'd like to dwell on the meaning of the East in this phrase from the Gospels. The original phrase in Greek sounds like Anti-Anatoli, Anatolie, and the Latin Vulgata translated this phrase as in Oriente, a word familiar to you because in English we use the word Oriental, which has to do with the East. So what is the East? What is the Orient in the Gospel? What was the Orient for the early Christians, and how this concept of Orient, of the East, developed, and how it affected the idea of Christian unity, how ecumenical or maybe counter-ecumenical it was in the history. That's what I briefly tried to survey in my presentation. So what was the East for the writer of the Gospel, for Matthew, in this passage? It was Persia. Persia was a state, an empire, which was located to the east from the Roman Empire. By the time of Jesus, Judea had been included to the Roman Empire. It had its own political system, its own rulers, but still it was a part of the Roman Empire, and Persia was its neighbor, but this neighbor was troublesome, sometimes was quite aggressive. There was a rivalry between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. This rivalry, as a matter of fact, affected the unity of the earliest Christian community. Well, after the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, Christianity became its majority religion. In Persia, Christianity was never majority religion, but it existed in Persia, which at that time was predominantly Zoroastrian, and it tolerated Christianity as a minority, and Christians in the Persian state developed their own autonomy, a significant autonomy from the Roman Church for political reasons, primarily because, well, Persians would not tolerate a church which was submitted to its enemy, the Roman Empire. And also this rivalry between Rome and Persia affected the interpretation of the incarnation in the early church. In the early 5th century, some controversies engulfed the Christian church in the Roman Empire. This was the so-called Christological controversy, and it actually discussed the way in which God became man. For some Christians, there was a man, Jesus, who received God, and God, the divine Logos, indwelt in Jesus, and they coexisted together under, so to say, the same roof, in the same shell, as it were, of Jesus's humanity. And the Jesus humanity was to a great extent autonomous from the divine Logos. Such interpretation was contested by other Christians, by the majority of Christians in the Roman Empire, and they believed that the divine Logos became a human being to the extent that his humanity, could not be separated from his divinity, and they constituted an intrinsic unity. So those two interpretations of the incarnation were discussed at the Council of Ephesus in 431, and the decision was taken that the Orthodox interpretation of the incarnation is the one that sees Jesus as one single being, with humanity and divinity intrinsically connected with one another, without any separation, without any autonomization of humanity. Those who disagreed, they had to flee the Roman Empire, and they installed themselves in the Persian Empire, and the Persian Empire welcomed them. And that was the first split within the global Christian community, the split which was facilitated by the political divide between Rome and Persia. The Roman Empire and Persia. At that time, the Roman Empire had its capital in Constantinople, now Istanbul, or the New Rome, as they called it. And at that time of the First Great Schism, the two Romes, the old one, the Rome in Lazio in Italy, and the new Rome in Constantinople on the shores of Bosphorus, were allies, very natural allies. And I would say that Rome and Constantinople were very natural allies who supported each other during almost the entire first millennium, Christian millennium. There were different schisms, there were different divisions in the Christian community, but Rome and Constantinople went hand in hand together, preserving the unity with one another. At that time, the divide between East and West cross-sected what we now call Syria. There was a Roman Syria on the Roman soil, and there was a Persian Syria, the Eastern Syria, on the Persian soil, and that was actually the division between East and West. The division which is reflected in the Gospel that we've just heard. For, as we said, for Jews, East was the Persia, and they considered themselves dwelling in the West, which was the Roman Empire. However, as the political map of the Middle East, of Europe, changed, and the Roman Empire dwindled and eventually became a relatively small state, occupying most of the Asia Minor and some territories around, the East became associated with this part of the Roman Empire, while the west part, the western part of the Roman Empire, the western part of what used to be the Roman Empire, was occupied by the so-called barbarians, the different tribes that sacked Rome in the beginning of the 5th century. And they established their own states. Those states evolved to political entities, and eventually to an empire which pretended to be the successor of the Roman Empire. And actually, the rivalry between that Western new empire, which is usually associated with the name of Charlemagne, the Frankish Empire, and what we now call Byzantine Empire, constituted a new divide between East and West. Now the Byzantium, what we now call Byzantium, became the New East, and what used to be the Frankish Empire became the New West. And as a matter of fact, this division, the new division between East and West, affected the old partnership, the old friendship between two major churches of the early Christianity, Rome and Constantinople, and contributed to the division between those two churches. That's how we came to what we could call the Second Great Schism, the schism between the Orthodox and the Catholic churches. Formally, this schism occurred in the 11th century, but it started evolving before that and continued to deepen after the 11th century. So we see how East and West, the concepts of the East and the West, contributed to the divisions within the global Christianity. And this division, it was affected to a great extent by political circumstances, by the situation, the rivalry, the political contests between the states that were hostile to each other. Unfortunately, the Church often complied with those political divides and realigned itself along those political divides. And now the question is, what is the solution? How this division can be overcome? And the solution, I believe, is in the gospel that we've just read itself. Because, yes, Persia and the Roman Empire, of which Judea was a part, were enemies. Yes, they did not communicate with one another often and friendly. Yes, the peoples perceive themselves, perceive the other part, like the Westerners, like Jews, perceive the Persians, the Easterners, as a different people, as the others, sometimes as enemies, and the other way around. Yet, the Gospel tells us the story that the Persian Magi came to Judea to venerate the Messiah. They overcame the divide. They crossed this divide, and they neglected it, and regardless of it, they came to Jesus. And yes, the Jews who witnessed it, they received the Persians as their guests, and there was a kind of a moment of reconciliation between the East and the West in this event of veneration of Jesus by Magi. I think this is a very strong ecumenical message for us, for the modern Christians, that we can and we should overcome our divisions. We should cross the borders, those imaginary borders, because this divide between East and West is completely imagined. It's completely now fantasy, and we just need to overcome this fantasy and to reach out to each other, just as the Magi did to Jesus, and as the Jews who were around Jesus, who dwelt at that time in that place, welcomed the guests from the East. So that is, I think, is the ecumenical message for us these days from the Gospel that we've just had, and it may help us to move further ecumenically towards overcoming the divisions between the East and the West.